World War II, lasting from 1939 to 1945, was the most devastating and widespread conflict in human history, involving more than 30 nations across every continent. It began with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, triggering Britain and France to declare war. Over the next 6 years, battles raged across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, while the war reached deep into civilian populations, transforming economies and societies. The war's vast scale was matched only by its horrors, from the Holocaust to the atomic bombings, leaving an indelible mark on global history. Key nations involved and their motivations: Axis versus Allies. For the Axis powers, we begin with Germany. Led by Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany sought to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, expand its territory, Lebensraum, and establish a totalitarian regime based on Aryan racial supremacy. Hitler's ambition was to dominate Europe and eliminate those he deemed undesirable. Italy. Under Benito Mussolini, Italy aimed to recreate the Roman Empire and establish dominance in the Mediterranean. Italy's fascist regime aligned itself with Germany to achieve these imperial ambitions. Japan, driven by militarism and a quest for natural resources, Japan sought to build an empire in Asia. Its aggressive expansion into China and Southeast Asia led to its involvement in the war, seeking dominance over the Pacific. Now for the Allied powers, we begin with the United States. Initially neutral, the US entered the war after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The US fought to defeat fascism and secure democracy globally, becoming a leading force in the Allied victory, the Soviet Union. After an initial non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, the USSR joined the Allies when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The Soviet Union sought to protect itself from German invasion and later expanded its influence across Eastern Europe. The United Kingdom, under Winston Churchill's leadership, Britain fought to preserve its empire and protect democratic Europe from Nazi domination. France, defeated early by Germany, France was divided between the Nazi-occupied North and the collaborationist Vichy regime. The Free French forces, led by Charles de Gaulle, continued fighting alongside the Allies. Other nations such as Canada, Australia, and China also played significant roles in the Allied effort, while countries like Finland, Hungary, and Romania were aligned with the Axis. This conflict would ultimately play a large role in shaping modern geopolitics. World War II profoundly reshaped global power structures and set the stage for the modern era. Several key outcomes included the Cold War. The war's end saw the rise of two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, who soon became ideological and geopolitical rivals. This division created the Cold War, which shaped world affairs for the next 4 decades. Decolonization. The war weakened the colonial powers, especially Britain and France, and spurred independence movements across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, leading to the end of European empires. The creation of the United Nations, the atrocities and devastation of the war motivated nations to form the United Nations in 1945, aimed at preventing future global conflicts and promoting international cooperation. The division of Europe. Germany was divided into East and West, with Eastern Europe falling under Soviet influence and Western Europe aligning with the United States, setting the boundaries for the Iron Curtain. The birth of modern economic systems, post-war reconstruction, notably through the Marshall Plan, led to the economic recovery of Western Europe and Japan. It also established international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. But before we get to this point, in this documentary we will dive into Hitler's rise to power, how one man's ambitions and the failed peace after World War I ignited a global conflict. Pivotal battles. From the beaches of Normandy to the siege of Stalingrad, we will cover the decisive moments that changed the course of history. Atrocities and war crimes. A closer look at the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews and millions of others were murdered, and the brutality faced by civilians on all fronts. The aftermath. How the war's end gave birth to new political realities, the Cold War, decolonization, and the rebuilding of war-torn nations. This documentary will take you from the war's origins to its final days and beyond, showing how the legacy of World War II still shapes the world we live in today. Chapter 1. The Origins of the War. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to bring an end to the horrors of World War I and ensure lasting peace in Europe. But instead, it planted the seeds for another, even more devastating conflict just 2 decades later. Key provisions of the treaty include War Guilt Clause, Article 231. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for starting the war, a humiliation that deeply angered the German population and political class. The War Guilt Clause placed the entire blame for World War I on Germany, inflicting a deep sense of resentment and national humiliation. Reparations. Germany was ordered to pay vast sums to the Allied nations, which crippled its already weakened economy. These reparations devastated Germany's economy, leading to mass unemployment, poverty, and the collapse of the German mark. These hardships fueled anger and a desire for revenge. Military restrictions. Germany's military was reduced to 100,000 troops, with no air force, tanks, or submarines allowed. Its navy was also significantly limited. The treaty dismantled Germany's military power, leaving the nation feeling vulnerable and defenseless against potential threats from neighboring countries. Territorial losses. Germany lost significant territories in Europe, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, parts of Prussia to Poland, and all of its overseas colonies. Germany was stripped of 13% of its territory and all its colonies, further deepening the sense of loss and injustice felt by the German people. The treaty also had a broader impact on Europe, including rise of new nations. The treaty reshaped the map of Europe, creating new nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, but also left many ethnic minorities stranded within these new borders, leading to future tensions. While the treaty sought to create stability, it also created new states from the ruins of empires. Many of these new borders were drawn without consideration for ethnic and cultural divides, leading to friction in the years to come. The Weimar Republic. In Germany, the Weimar Republic was established after Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, but the new democratic government was viewed as weak, corrupt, and incapable of dealing with the economic and political crises. The Weimar Republic struggled under the weight of reparations, political extremism, and a populace disillusioned with democracy. It would eventually fall to the rise of Adolf Hitler. The legacy of the treaty, sowing the seeds of World War II. German resentment. The Treaty of Versailles created a sense of betrayal and anger within Germany. It became a symbol of national humiliation, and many Germans, including a young Adolf Hitler, viewed the treaty as an unjust diktat, dictated peace. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles became a rallying cry for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. They promised to tear up the treaty, restore Germany's military power, and reclaim lost territory. In doing so, they tapped into the deep wounds left by the post-war settlement. Economic instability and extremism. The global economic crisis of the Great Depression in 1929 only exacerbated the problems caused by the treaty. Germany's economic collapse provided fertile ground for radical political movements, including communism and fascism. The global economic crisis further weakened Germany, and millions turned to extremist ideologies as they lost faith in democracy and the Weimar government. The Nazis capitalized on this discontent, promising a return to national pride and prosperity. The treaty as a catalyst for World War II. While the treaty was designed to prevent another war, its harsh terms directly contributed to the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly in Germany and Italy. The resentment and instability it caused paved the way for World War II. In its attempt to secure peace, the Treaty of Versailles inadvertently set the stage for the deadliest conflict in human history, as a humiliated Germany sought revenge and redemption on the battlefield. Rise of fascism and Nazism, Mussolini, Hitler, and Japan's militarism. In the aftermath of World War I, widespread economic hardship, political instability, and social unrest across Europe gave rise to authoritarian ideologies. Fascism and Nazism emerged as powerful movements that promised to restore national pride, economic stability and order by rejecting democracy and embracing authoritarianism, nationalism and militarism. Fascism is an authoritarian and nationalistic system that emphasizes state power, military strength, and often a single charismatic leader. It glorifies violence, seeks to suppress opposition, and rejects both democracy and communism. Nazism was a form of fascism specific to Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, that adds racial purity, anti-Semitism, and Aryan supremacy as central elements of its ideology. Italy, Mussolini's rise to power. Italy, despite being on the winning side of World War I, was in a state of political and economic turmoil. Widespread poverty, discontent over territorial gains, and fear of communism made the country ripe for a political upheaval. Into this chaos stepped Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned nationalist. In 1919, Mussolini founded the Fascist Party, promising to restore Italy's glory, suppress communism, and rebuild the nation through strength and discipline. In 1922, Mussolini and his blackshirts marched on Rome, threatening a coup. The Italian king, fearing civil war, appointed Mussolini as prime minister. Over the next few years, Mussolini dismantled democracy and established a totalitarian regime. Mussolini's regime emphasized nationalism, militarism, and the idea of a reborn Roman Empire. He used propaganda, youth organizations, and terror tactics to control the population and suppress dissent. Mussolini's vision of a new Italian empire led to aggressive expansion. In 1935, Italy invaded and occupied Ethiopia, demonstrating its imperial ambitions. Germany, Hitler, and the rise of Nazism. Germany, reeling from defeat in World War I and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, faced hyperinflation, political extremism, and social unrest. The fledgling Weimar Republic struggled to maintain order. Adolf Hitler, a former soldier embittered by Germany's defeat, joined the German Workers' Party in 1919. By 1921, he became the leader of the party, which he renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. Nazism blended extreme nationalism with racial purity, anti-Semitism, and the desire to overturn the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler promised to restore Germany's greatness, rebuild the military, and unite all German-speaking peoples in a new Reich. In 1923, Hitler attempted to overthrow the Weimar government in the Beer Hall Putsch. Though it failed, Hitler used his trial to gain national attention, and during his imprisonment, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his vision for Germany. The Great Depression of 1929 further destabilized Germany, allowing Hitler to gain support from desperate voters. In 1933, he was appointed Chancellor, and shortly after used the Reichstag fire to consolidate dictatorial power. Once in power, Hitler transformed Germany into a totalitarian state, using propaganda, the SS, and the Gestapo to suppress opposition. He rearmed Germany in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, preparing for territorial expansion. Japan, militarism and imperial expansion. Japan, though on the winning side of World War I, felt marginalized by Western powers in the post-war settlements. This, coupled with economic troubles and rapid industrialization, led to a growing sense of nationalism and militarism. By the late 1920s, Japan's military leaders gained increasing influence over the government. They promoted the idea that Japan needed to expand its empire to secure resources and establish dominance in Asia. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, marking the beginning of its aggressive expansion across Asia. Japan's leaders believed that creating a vast empire was the only way to secure Japan's future prosperity and survival. Japan's imperial ambitions led to its formal alignment with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in the Tripartite Pact of 1940, forming the Axis powers. Together, these nations sought to dominate Europe and Asia. Japan's ambitions didn't stop at Manchuria. By the late 1930s, Japan had expanded into China, and in 1941 it launched a full-scale war against the United States by attacking Pearl Harbor, drawing the US into World War II. Fascism, Nazism, and militarism had taken root across Europe and Asia, driven by promises of national revival and imperial glory. But as these powers expanded their reach, the world was inevitably drawn into another global conflict, World War II. By the early 1930s, Benito Mussolini, now firmly in control of Italy, sought to restore the glory of the ancient Roman Empire. His fascist ideology demanded territorial expansion, and Africa became the focal point of his imperial dreams. Mussolini's focus on Ethiopia wasn't random. In 1896, Italy suffered a humiliating defeat against Ethiopian forces at the Battle of Adwa during the First Italo-Ethiopian War. It was the only major victory by an African nation against a European colonial power at the time. By the early 1930s, Italy had begun preparing for a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia. Mussolini sought to exploit diplomatic tensions in Europe and the League of Nations' weakness in enforcing peace. In December 1934, a border skirmish between Italian and Ethiopian forces at Walwal on the Somali-Ethiopian border provided Mussolini with the pretext he needed to launch a full-scale invasion. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia appealed to the League of Nations for support, but despite condemning Italy's aggression, the League failed to take meaningful action to stop Mussolini's plans. On October 3, 1935, Mussolini ordered his troops to invade Ethiopia from both Eritrea in the north and Italian Somaliland in the southeast. What followed was a brutal and highly asymmetrical conflict. Italy brought modern warfare to Ethiopia, using tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons such as mustard gas against poorly equipped Ethiopian soldiers. The Ethiopians, fighting mostly with outdated rifles and swords, were no match for the Italian military machine. Despite being outgunned, Ethiopian forces led by Emperor Haile Selassie resisted fiercely. However, they were gradually pushed back by the superior Italian forces. Italy's use of poison gas, which was banned by international treaties, shocked the world. Italian forces dropped mustard gas from airplanes, targeting both soldiers and civilians. By May 1936, Italian forces had captured Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, and Mussolini declared the creation of the Italian East African Empire, with Ethiopia now under Italian control. Haile Selassie fled into exile, appealing again to the League of Nations, where he delivered a powerful speech denouncing the world's failure to stop Italy's aggression. But the League's inaction signaled its growing irrelevance. While the world condemned Mussolini's actions, no significant sanctions were imposed, and Italy's occupation of Ethiopia continued. Mussolini's conquest of Ethiopia marked one of the first major acts of aggression in the lead-up to World War II. It showcased the ineffectiveness of the League of Nations and emboldened other fascist powers, including Nazi Germany. Italy's victory in Ethiopia boosted Mussolini's domestic popularity and prestige, but led to international isolation, pushing Italy closer to Nazi Germany. This alliance would soon plunge Europe into global war. Under Italian occupation, Ethiopia suffered brutal repression. However, resistance continued, and in 1941, during World War II, Allied forces, including Ethiopian patriots, liberated the country. The conquest of Ethiopia was a key moment in Mussolini's imperial vision and a stark example of the unchecked aggression that would soon engulf the world in war. As the Axis powers solidified their ambitions, the fragile peace in Europe would soon crumble. The Spanish Civil War, fought between 1936 and 1939, was not just a brutal internal conflict in Spain. It was also a battleground for competing ideologies that would shape the world in the coming years. Democracy versus fascism, communism versus conservatism. It became a testing ground for the future combatants of World War II, with both Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy actively supporting the nationalist forces of General Francisco Franco, while the Soviet Union backed the Spanish Republic. In 1931, the Spanish monarchy was overthrown, and the Second Spanish Republic was established. The new government, dominated by left-wing parties, introduced reforms that alienated the military, landowners, and the Catholic Church. By 1936, Spain was deeply divided. The Popular Front, a coalition of left-wing parties, won the national elections, while right-wing elements in the military, led by General Francisco Franco, plotted to overthrow the Republic and restore conservative rule. On July 17, 1936, Franco and his nationalist forces launched a military coup against the Spanish Republic. What began as a rebellion soon escalated into a full-scale civil war, with international powers taking sides in the conflict. As the war progressed, Spain became a microcosm of the larger ideological struggle brewing in Europe. Germany and Italy sent troops, aircraft, and equipment to support Franco's nationalists, while the Soviet Union backed the Republic with military aid. Thousands of volunteers from around the world also joined the fight on both sides, including the famous international brigades. For Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, the Spanish Civil War was not just about helping Franco. It was an opportunity to test new military strategies, weapons and tactics that would later be used in World War II. Hitler and Mussolini saw the conflict as a chance to strengthen their alliance and demonstrate the power of fascism to the world. Germany's involvement in the war was primarily through the Condor Legion, a unit of German pilots, bombers and ground forces that played a decisive role in many of the nationalists' victories. The Germans used Spain as a testing ground for Blitzkrieg tactics, which would be employed on a much larger scale in Poland and France. The most infamous episode of German involvement in Spain came in April 1937, when the Condor Legion carried out a devastating air raid on the town of Guernica. The attack, which killed hundreds of civilians, shocked the world and became a symbol of the horrors of modern warfare. Italy sent over 70,000 troops to fight in Spain, along with tanks, aircraft and naval forces. Mussolini saw the war as a chance to expand Italy's influence in the Mediterranean and strengthen ties with Franco's regime. On the other side, the Soviet Union was the primary supporter of the Spanish Republic, sending weapons, military advisors, and organizing international communist volunteers to fight against Franco's fascist forces. However, Soviet support was limited and came with strings attached as Stalin sought to control the Republic's political direction. The war also attracted thousands of idealistic volunteers from around the world, including Americans, Britons, French, and others who joined the Republican side in the international brigades. These volunteers viewed the fight as a defense of democracy against the growing threat of fascism. By 1939, after years of brutal fighting, Franco's nationalists emerged victorious. The Spanish Republic, exhausted and abandoned by many of its international allies, fell. Franco established a fascist dictatorship that would rule Spain for the next 36 years. The Spanish Civil War served as a dress rehearsal for World War II. The Axis powers demonstrated their willingness to use military force to achieve their objectives, while the democratic nations of Europe, including Britain and France, remained largely passive, reluctant to intervene. This emboldened Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. The war showed the world that fascism could be victorious, and it became clear that Hitler and Mussolini would not hesitate to use war as a tool to achieve their ambitions. As the world watched Spain burn, Europe was on the path to a far larger and deadlier conflict, World War II. The Munich Agreement and the policy of appeasement are deeply interconnected, symbolizing the failed diplomatic efforts to prevent World War II by conceding to Adolf Hitler's territorial demands. The Munich Agreement, signed on September 30, 1938, was a settlement allowing Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland, a border region of Czechoslovakia inhabited largely by ethnic Germans. The agreement was signed by Adolf Hitler of Germany, Neville Chamberlain of Britain, Édouard Daladier of France and Benito Mussolini of Italy. Notably, Czechoslovakia was not included in the negotiations, despite being the country directly affected. Hitler claimed the Sudetenland under the pretext of uniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. Britain and France, eager to avoid war, accepted the terms rather than challenging Germany's aggressive expansion. Czechoslovakia was forced to give up the Sudetenland, which included its primary defenses and industries. Chamberlain famously declared the agreement as securing peace for our time, believing Hitler's promise that this was his last territorial demand. Consequences included strategic loss. Czechoslovakia's loss of the Sudetenland left it militarily vulnerable. Hitler's further aggression. In March 1939, Hitler broke his word and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, signaling the failure of the Munich Agreement and the policy of appeasement. The policy of appeasement involved making concessions to dictators like Hitler and Mussolini in the hopes of maintaining peace. It was most notably pursued by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain throughout the 1930s. Motivations for appeasement included avoiding another war. Memories of the horrors of World War I were fresh, and leaders were desperate to avoid another conflict. Economic challenges. Britain and France were still recovering from the Great Depression and were hesitant to engage in costly military conflicts. Perceived fairness. Many felt that Hitler's demands to unite ethnic Germans were reasonable and could stabilize Europe. And lastly, fear of communism. Some leaders believed a strong Germany could act as a buffer against Soviet communism. Consequences of appeasement included the empowerment of Hitler. Rather than satisfying Hitler, appeasement encouraged him to push for more aggressive territorial expansion. When Germany violated the Munich Agreement by occupying all of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, it became clear that appeasement had failed. The final straw came in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war, ending the policy of appeasement. The Munich Agreement and the appeasement policy are often cited as cautionary examples of the dangers of compromising with aggressive powers. Critics argue that had Britain and France confronted Hitler earlier, the war might have been contained or avoided. Instead, the delay gave Nazi Germany time to strengthen its military and grow more emboldened, eventually leading to the outbreak of World War II. Chapter 2. The Invasion of Poland and the Outbreak of War 1939. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was a significant non-aggression agreement signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on August 23, 1939. This pact had a profound impact on the events leading up to World War II and the early stages of the war. Terms of the pact included non-aggression clause. The core of the agreement was a promise that neither Germany nor the Soviet Union would attack the other or support any third-party aggressions against each other. Secret protocol. A hidden part of the agreement, this clause secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence between the two powers, effectively allowing them to partition and occupy various countries, including Poland, the most critical part of the protocol. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Poland between them. Germany would take the western part, while the Soviet Union would take the eastern part, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These were assigned to the Soviet sphere, with later modifications, Romania. The pact recognized Soviet interests in parts of Romania, particularly Bessarabia. Motivations for the pact include Germany's motivation. Adolf Hitler wanted to avoid a two-front war while preparing for the invasion of Poland. With this pact, Germany could focus on Western Europe without worrying about Soviet intervention. Soviet motivation. Joseph Stalin wanted to buy time to rebuild and modernize the Soviet military after the purges of the 1930s. By aligning with Germany, Stalin also hoped to expand Soviet influence into Eastern Europe without immediate confrontation. Impact of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. The pact paved the way for Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, which marked the official beginning of World War II. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland from the east, effectively carving the country in half, as per the terms of the secret protocol. Britain and France declared war on Germany in response to this invasion, marking the end of appeasement and the start of the conflict. The Soviet Union, following the pact, extended its control over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and annexed eastern Poland. Finland was also invaded during the Winter War, 1939 to 1940, although the Soviets met unexpected resistance there. The pact allowed Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to maintain an uneasy, pragmatic relationship while expanding their territories. Germany benefited from Soviet resources, especially raw materials like oil and grain, which were vital for the German war machine during its early campaigns. Despite the pact, Hitler's long-term plans always included invading the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Less than 2 years after the pact was signed, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. This betrayal ended the Nazi-Soviet alliance and forced the Soviet Union into an alliance with Britain and later the United States, forming the backbone of the Allied powers. Ultimately, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is one of the most controversial diplomatic agreements of the 20th century. It directly contributed to the outbreak of World War II and the devastation of Poland. The secret protocol's division of Eastern Europe had long-lasting consequences, influencing post-war boundaries and Soviet domination of Eastern Europe during the Cold War. Blitzkrieg is a term often associated with Germany's military tactics during World War II. Translated as lightning war, Blitzkrieg was a strategy that emphasized rapid, coordinated attacks to overwhelm and defeat opponents before they could mount an effective defense. Blitzkrieg was not entirely new, but was an evolution of earlier military strategies. It drew on the lessons of World War I, particularly the need to break the deadlock of trench warfare by achieving rapid breakthroughs. The interwar years saw the development of the necessary technology and tactics. The German military studied and refined the ideas of fast-moving warfare, with emphasis on combined arms, integrating tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support. Central to the Blitzkrieg strategy were tanks, or panzers, which spearheaded the attacks. These were supported by motorized infantry and artillery, all of which moved quickly to exploit breaches in the enemy's defenses. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, played a critical role by bombing enemy positions, disrupting communications, and attacking supply lines, further disorienting and demoralizing the enemy. Blitzkrieg relied on precise coordination between ground and air forces, as well as speed. The goal was to create shock and confusion, causing the enemy to collapse before they could organize a counterattack. Blitzkrieg was first demonstrated during the invasion of Poland in September 1939. German forces quickly overran Polish defenses, leading to the fall of Warsaw in just a few weeks. The strategy was most famously used during the invasion of France and the Low Countries in May 1940. German forces bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by advancing through Belgium and the Ardennes, encircling and defeating Allied forces in a matter of weeks. The rapid fall of France was a shock to the world. Paris was occupied, and France was forced to sign an armistice by June 1940, showcasing the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg was initially successful in the Soviet Union, with German forces making significant advances. However, the vast distances, harsh weather, and stiffening Soviet resistance eventually bogged down the German advance, revealing the limitations of Blitzkrieg in extended campaigns. Blitzkrieg required well-maintained supply lines and the ability to rapidly resupply and reinforce advancing units. In the Soviet Union, stretched supply lines and partisan attacks undermined the effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg approach. The Blitzkrieg strategy met its first major failure during the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe was unable to gain air superiority, and the planned invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was ultimately called off. Blitzkrieg tactics were adapted to different environments, such as the deserts of North Africa. However, as the war progressed, the Allies became better at countering Blitzkrieg with improved coordination and more effective defenses. The Battle of Kursk in the Soviet Union was one of the largest tank battles in history and marked the end of large-scale Blitzkrieg tactics. The Soviets had prepared deep defensive lines, and the Germans were unable to achieve a breakthrough. In summary, Blitzkrieg was a highly effective military strategy that played a critical role in Germany's early successes during World War II. However, its limitations became apparent as the war progressed, particularly on the Eastern Front, where the vastness of the Soviet Union and the resilience of its defenders eventually blunted the effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg approach. The fall of Poland and the early war in Europe marked the beginning of World War II, with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland triggering the conflict and setting the stage for further aggression across the continent. This period, from September 1939 to mid-1940, saw rapid German expansion and the failure of Western Allied attempts to stop Hitler's advances. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany launched Operation Vollweiß, Case White, the invasion of Poland, using the newly developed Blitzkrieg tactics. The invasion combined fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and close air support from the Luftwaffe to overwhelm Polish defenses. The German Air Force bombed key Polish military targets, railways, and cities, crippling Poland's ability to mobilize and coordinate its forces. German tanks broke through Poland's border defenses, bypassing fortified areas and advancing rapidly into the country's interior, cutting off Polish forces from their supply lines and reinforcements. Despite being outnumbered and under-equipped, the Polish army fought valiantly. They attempted to hold key positions along the Vistula River and in major cities such as Warsaw. But the speed and coordination of the German attack left them disorganized. Warsaw was bombed heavily, but held out under siege until September 28th, when the city finally surrendered after fierce resistance. The Battle of Bzura was the largest battle fought during the invasion, where Polish forces attempted a counterattack, but were eventually encircled and defeated by superior German forces. On September 17th, the Soviet Union, under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland from the east, sealing the country's fate. The Red Army moved quickly, encountering little resistance from the already embattled Polish forces. Poland was now caught between two invaders, and with no hope of reinforcement from Britain or France, Polish forces were quickly overwhelmed. Polish government officials fled to Romania and later to France, where a government in exile was established. By early October 1939, Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, in accordance with the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Germany took control of western Poland, while the Soviet Union annexed eastern Poland, where it carried out mass arrests, deportations, and executions of Polish officers and intellectuals, for example, the Katyn massacre in 1940. The swift defeat of Poland demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Blitzkrieg and Nazi Germany's military capabilities. After the fall of Poland, a period of relative calm followed in Western Europe, sometimes referred to as the Phony War, or Blitzkrieg in German, from late 1939 to early 1940. Despite the declarations of war by Britain and France on Germany, no major military operations took place on the Western Front for several months. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, but neither was ready to launch an immediate offensive. British forces began deploying to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force, BF, fortifying defensive positions along the French-German border behind the heavily defended Maginot Line. Germany, meanwhile, focused on consolidating its gains in Poland and preparing for future campaigns in Western Europe. Despite the lack of major fighting, this period saw important political and economic developments. Britain implemented a naval blockade of Germany, while German U-boats, submarines, targeted Allied shipping in the Atlantic, initiating the Battle of the Atlantic. During this period, the Soviet Union annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and launched the Winter War against Finland, November 1939, March 1940, though the Finns put up fierce resistance. On April 9, 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, invading Denmark and Norway. Denmark was overrun in a single day, offering little resistance to the German forces. Norway, with its strategically important coastline and access to iron ore supplies from Sweden, was a more critical target. The Norwegian campaign lasted until early June, with British and French forces attempting to support the Norwegians, but German forces ultimately secured the country after fierce fighting, including naval and airborne operations. The fall of Norway gave Germany control of the North Sea and access to essential resources, further strengthening its strategic position in Europe. In the spring of 1940, Hitler turned his attention to Western Europe, launching Operation Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. On May 10, 1940, Germany simultaneously invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands to bypass the heavily fortified Maginot Line along the French-German border. The Netherlands fell within 5 days after intense bombing of Rotterdam and rapid German advances. Belgium held out slightly longer, but was quickly overwhelmed by German forces using Blitzkrieg tactics. Germany's main offensive, however, was through the Ardennes forest, a lightly defended and rugged region where the French believed a large-scale attack was unlikely. German forces quickly pushed through the Ardennes and broke into northern France, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely. By mid-May, German tanks under General Heinz Guderian had reached the English Channel, cutting off and encircling British and French forces in northern France. The rapid advance led to the Dunkirk evacuation, May 26th of June 4th, 1940, where over 300,000 British and French troops were evacuated from the beaches by a hastily assembled fleet of military and civilian vessels in what was dubbed Operation Dynamo. With the Allied forces retreating, Germany pressed its advantage. The French defences collapsed, and on June 14, 1940, German forces entered Paris without resistance. France surrendered on June 22, 1940, and the country was divided into a German-occupied zone in the north and a nominally independent state in the south, known as Vichy France. Aftermath and significance of the early war include rapid German dominance. By mid-1940, Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in less than a year. Blitzkrieg tactics had proven devastatingly effective, and Germany appeared unstoppable. Britain standing alone. With France's fall, Britain remained the only major power fighting against Germany. Winston Churchill, who became British Prime Minister in May 1940, rallied the British people, vowing never to surrender despite the grim situation. Shifting global alignments, the rapid success of Nazi Germany shook global confidence in the Allies. Countries like the Soviet Union and the United States watched warily as the balance of power in Europe dramatically shifted. These early victories laid the foundation for the next phase of World War II, particularly the Battle of Britain and the widening of the conflict to include more nations and theatres of war. The period known as the Phony War, or Blitzkrieg, refers to the early months of World War II, specifically from September 1939, after the German invasion of Poland, to April 1940. During this time, despite Britain and France having declared war on Germany, little military action occurred on the Western Front. After the swift defeat of Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, marking the official start of their involvement in World War II. The Allied powers aimed to prepare for a significant confrontation with Germany following its aggressive actions in Poland, but their military response was initially slow and hesitant. British Expeditionary Force BEF. Britain deployed the BEF to France, positioning troops along the Maginot Line and in northern France in anticipation of a German attack. The BEF was primarily composed of professional soldiers, and its numbers were limited compared to the German forces. French military strategy. The French relied heavily on the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the border with Germany. They anticipated a German attack through Belgium, leading them to prepare their defences accordingly. Although both Britain and France were technically at war with Germany, no significant military operations took place along the Western Front during this period. German forces also adopted a defensive posture, focusing instead on consolidating their gains in Poland and preparing for future offensives in Western Europe. The war at sea was more active than on land. The Royal Navy imposed a naval blockade on Germany, aiming to cut off supplies and weaken its economy. Germany responded with U-boat operations against Allied shipping in the Atlantic, marking the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic. The British also conducted minor naval operations, including the Battle of the River Plate, December 1939, which resulted in the defeat of the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. The British and French governments worked to strengthen their economies and mobilize for war, implementing rationing and increasing military production. Diplomatically, Britain sought to solidify alliances with other nations, such as Poland and the Balkan states, while France sought to reassure its allies in the region. The Phony War had a significant impact on public perception in both Britain and France. Public morale. Initial enthusiasm for the war waned, as the lack of action led to disillusionment among the public. Many people expected a repeat of World War I, leading to calls for military action. Fear of German aggression. News of German advances in Poland and the successful Soviet invasion heightened fears of what might come next. Propaganda efforts aimed to maintain morale and foster a sense of unity against the common enemy. The Phony War came to an end with the onset of Germany's invasion of Denmark and Norway on April 9, 1940. This military action demonstrated the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg tactics and forced Britain and France to re-evaluate their military strategies and readiness for a more active conflict. The quick German conquest of Denmark and Norway signaled that Hitler was not willing to remain idle, prompting Britain to launch military operations to assist Norway and counter German expansion. The period allowed Britain and France to regroup, strengthen their military capabilities and adjust their strategies, even if progress was slow. The Blitzkrieg provided a brief respite that ultimately proved crucial for planning future operations. The Phony War highlighted weaknesses in Allied military strategy and intelligence, particularly the underestimation of German capabilities and intentions. The inactivity of this period set the stage for a more aggressive Allied approach as the war progressed, culminating in the significant military actions that followed, including the invasion of France and the Battle of Britain. The Phony War ultimately served as a transitional phase in World War II, marking the end of the initial period of conflict and leading to a series of more intense and decisive battles in Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic was a prolonged naval conflict that lasted from 1939 to the end of World War II in 1945. It was one of the longest and most critical battles of the war, encompassing a struggle for control of the Atlantic Ocean between the Allied powers, primarily Britain, the United States, and Canada, and Germany. This battle was crucial for maintaining supply lines and ensuring the success of Allied operations across Europe. The Atlantic Ocean served as the main supply route for Allied forces, carrying troops, equipment, and essential resources from North America to Europe. Control of this vital waterway was essential for both sides. After the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Germany recognized the need to disrupt Allied shipping to weaken their war efforts. Germany employed U-boats, submarines, as a primary weapon to target Allied merchant ships. The early months of the war saw the U-boat fleet conducting operations in the Atlantic, aiming to cut off supplies to Britain. The British Royal Navy was initially successful in combating U-boats, using depth charges, convoy systems, and anti-submarine warfare tactics. However, losses among merchant ships were significant. This was an early naval engagement where the British fleet defeated the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee off the coast of Uruguay. This victory helped maintain British control of the South Atlantic. The happy time, between 1940 and early 1941, German U-boats enjoyed considerable success, sinking thousands of Allied ships, particularly in the North Atlantic. The Wolfpack tactics were developed, where groups of U-boats would coordinate attacks against convoys, overwhelming the defending escorts. In response to U-boat attacks, the Allies implemented a convoy system, grouping merchant ships together under the protection of naval escorts. This strategy aimed to minimize losses and improve the chances of defending against U-boat attacks. Both sides began to innovate in terms of technology. The Allies developed more effective sonar and depth charges, while Germany introduced more advanced U-boats, including the Type 7 and Type 9 models. The introduction of the U-boat, Type 9 and the use of long-range aircraft extended the range of German operations, allowing U-boats to threaten transatlantic convoys more effectively. With the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, the United States began supplying Britain with war materials, increasing the number of ships crossing the Atlantic and escalating the conflict. The U.S. Navy began escorting convoys as well. In early 1942, German U-boats conducted Operation Drumbeat, targeting unescorted Allied shipping along the U.S. East Coast. The operation was initially successful, sinking numerous vessels and creating panic among American ship owners. Allied counteroffensives, 1942 to 1943. The Allies improved their anti-submarine warfare tactics, incorporating long-range aircraft for reconnaissance and patrol, improved sonar, and more effective convoy systems. The Allies' ability to break German naval codes significantly improved their intelligence regarding U-boat operations, allowing for better convoy routing and evasion of U-boat groups. Battle of Convoy PQ-17, July 1942. This disastrous convoy was heavily attacked by U-boats and Luftwaffe aircraft, resulting in significant losses. The miscommunication and lack of coordinated defense highlighted weaknesses in Allied strategy. By 1943, the tide began to turn in favor of the Allies. The introduction of escort carriers equipped with aircraft for air cover enhanced the protection of convoys. Improved tactics, technology, and increased numbers of escorts led to a dramatic decline in U-boat effectiveness. The Allies began to sink U-boats at a higher rate than they could be built. The battle reached its peak intensity in mid-1943, with large-scale Allied offensives against U-boat bases in France and Germany. Control of the Atlantic was crucial for the Allies to maintain their supply lines to Europe. The ability to transport troops, equipment, and resources was essential for launching operations like the D-Day invasion. The failure of Germany to achieve dominance in the Atlantic significantly hindered their war efforts. The U-boat campaign strained German resources and diverted attention away from other fronts. The battle spurred significant advancements in naval warfare technology, including sonar, anti-submarine weapons, and air power. These innovations shaped the future of naval combat. The Battle of the Atlantic marked the beginning of significant U.S. military involvement in World War II. The U.S. Navy's participation was critical in tipping the balance against German U-boats. This concludes Part 1 of World War II, The Complete Story. Like and subscribe if you would to see Part 2 and 3 go public.